It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Emily Carver, on your TV and radio. So on the show this morning, fresh polling shows Labour on a whopping 50% of the national vote. GDP figures show a glimmer of hope for the UK economy. It's revealed we've had 15 housing ministers since the Conservatives came to power. And with knife crime at an all-time high, what can be done? Busy show today, but first, let's get the headlines.
Good morning, it's just gone 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Rescue workers say the 72-hour golden period of finding survivors alive is closing following Monday's earthquakes in southern Turkey and northern Syria. The number of dead has now risen to over 21,000. But there are still glimmers of hope. A 10-day-old baby has been rescued alongside his mother. The pair spent more than 90 hours under the rubble before being freed. The World Health Organization warns, though, that the death toll is expected to rise still. 70 members of the UK International Search and Rescue Team have joined the effort to try and find people in amongst the rubble. Journalist Umut Tangor describes the situation as desperate. The Chancellor has warned the UK isn't out of the woods yet. It's after the latest figures show the economy narrowly avoided falling into recession in the final quarter of last year. The data from the Office for National Statistics reveals the economy saw zero growth between October and December. The final month of 2022 saw GDP down by 0.5%, but overall, the annual GDP rate grew by 4.1%. Labour's called for urgent measures to be brought forward to help families with the cost of living crisis. The Chancellor has welcomed the figures but warns there's still more to be done.
The fact that we have avoided recession, in fact we're the fastest growing major country last year, shows there is underlying resilience in the UK economy. But we are not out of the woods. Inflation is still much too high. That is causing pain for families up and down the country, which is why we need to stick to our plan to halve inflation. If we do that and play to our strengths in science and technology, we really can be one of the most prosperous countries in Europe.
Labour has comfortably held West Lancashire in the by-election after Ashley Dalton was voted in as the country's newest MP. She secured 8,000 more votes than her Conservative counterpart for the region. In her acceptance speech, she demanded a general election, telling the Tories to move out of the way. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Emily.
Good morning and welcome to The Briefing with me, Emily Carver, sitting in for Tom Harwood. So, a little bit of good news. New GDP data shows the UK economy avoided recession by a whisker last year, but with drug company AstraZeneca choosing Ireland over the UK for its new £320 million factory and the CBI calling for lower taxes, is it time Jeremy Hunt scrapped that planned corporation tax hike? Then, knife crime deaths have reached a record high in England and Wales. According to the ONS, there have been 282 homicides committed using a knife in the year to March 2022, a whopping 19% rise on the previous year. What's to blame for this fatal rise? And it's been revealed that we have had not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, but 15 housing ministers since the Conservatives came to power. Is this rapid turnover to blame for the government's failure to get to grips with the housing crisis? But first this morning, the latest results of the GB News People's Poll. The Conservative vote remains at a flat 21% this week, leaving Labour with half of the national vote, according to the poll. This comes just after the West Lancashire by-election, which saw Labour's Ashley Dalton voted in as the new MP with 8,000 more votes than her Conservative counterpart. I'm joined now by Matt Goodwin, Professor of Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. Matt, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So, Conservatives on 21%, Labour on 50%. Can a governing party come back from such dire levels of support?
Well, in theory, yes, they can come back, Emily, although in practice, no governing party has ever come back to go on and win the next election from this kind of low. So we are seeing the Conservative Party still at this real historic low level of support, low 20s. And this, of course, is coming more than 100 days since Rishi Sunak's appointment as PM. So we don't really have any evidence of a bounce in the polls for the Conservatives, perhaps 18 months or so away from the next election. It's not looking good, to put it simply.
Now, your polling also talked about Brexit. Apparently, people think that the Labour Party would be as good at managing Brexit as the Conservatives.
Yeah, so this is, again, I think a really troubling finding for the Conservative Party, because they no longer own any of the issues that you might expect a Conservative Party to own. In this case, we asked voters, who do you think is the best party to manage Brexit? Labour's actually ahead of the Conservatives. And it's the same story, by the way, on the economy, cost of living, the NHS, even immigration, in some recent polling. So the key point in all of this, Emily, is when parties don't own particular issues, it makes it very difficult for them to go on and win the next election. You think about Margaret Thatcher, she owned inflation, she owned industrial relations. You think about Tony Blair, he owned public services, he owned education. Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives today don't really own any big issue in British politics. That's a really big problem for them.
I'm thinking that the polling also shows that people are missing Boris Johnson.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. We asked all voters of the three prime ministers we've had since 2019, which is your favourite. So among all voters, Boris Johnson comes top, followed by Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss barely on the radar. Actually, only 2% of voters choose Liz Truss. But among Conservative voters, people who voted Conservative in 2019, I mean, Boris Johnson has a phenomenal lead. 52% of those voters say Boris Johnson, 18% say Rishi Sunak. So, Johnson may be struggling among a certain section of the electorate. He's certainly unpopular among your sort of Remainers, your Londoners and so on. But actually, among 2019 Conservatives, he is still seen by a long way as the best Prime Minister that we've had since the 2019 general election.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Matt Goodwin of Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, taking us through that latest polling data. Seems people still wish Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. Let me know if you do. And moving on, amidst the cost of living crisis, we've been keeping tabs on how both prices and the economy are doing. We can tell you now that GDP figures released in the last few minutes show the economy fell by 0.5% in December, but the figures have remained relatively stable over the final quarter of the year and have even grown by 4.1% across the whole of 2022. I'm delighted to be joined by David Page, Head of Macro Research, AXA Investment Managers. Is this a little bit of a glimmer of hope for the UK economy?
Well, potentially. I mean, we're not in recession, but that's a fairly low bar. There had been an expectation that we would see a slight shrinkage in the economy in Q4. But as it turns out, as you say, it's been flat. That's because we saw marginally better growth come through over October which helped keep the economy flat. But when we look at what happened in December, the service sector fell back by 0.8% on the month. It was a huge fall. Looks like it's probably impacted to some extent by some of the strikes, perhaps consumer spending being restrained because people couldn't enjoy some of the consumer services. And that really sets the economy up for a pretty weak first quarter, albeit that we would hope to see some recovery come through in that sector in January. So as we look to 2023, we didn't quite end up in 2022 in a recession, but that recession looks like it's in the post. We certainly expect to see contraction in Q1. We're expecting it in Q2 as well. So that gives us the 2 quarters of decline. And actually with a flat for Q4, you're looking at an economy that's basically contracted over the course of 4 quarters, already quite a long run. The Bank of England, of course, thinking that recession could last longer. So yes, through a very narrow prism, it's marginally better than we thought, but it's far from great.
Right. Well, also news today is that the drug giant AstraZeneca has decided that it would be better off having its £320 million factory in Ireland, in Dublin, rather than in the UK. They cite the tax regime in this country as being the reason for that. Do you think there's more and more pressure on Jeremy Hunt to axe that corporation tax hike that is planned for next month?
Well, not really. I mean, the UK sort of obviously stands at a disadvantaged tax rate to Ireland, which is a very small economy that operates on very low tax rates and has tried to sort of have an economy based on that. If we compare the UK to sort of other peers, the UK corporate tax rate is very low. More likely, I think, what's been impacting foreign direct investment over the last few years has been the massive political uncertainty that's been invoked by first Brexit in itself, then the very poorly managed Brexit, the lack of direction that we've had, and obviously the sort of, frankly, government incompetence that we've seen, which culminated obviously in the worst days of the Truss government, which, to be fair, PM Sunak does seem to be addressing to some extent now. So David, I think when businesses...
Sorry, David,
think when businesses from overseas are... Sorry, go on.
Sorry, what can be done then to boost investment into this country? If it's not working at the moment, what can be done?
I think we need clarity of where the growth strategy comes from. That includes sort of addressing some of the issues of trade that have been significantly up in the air since the Brexit period and really haven't been pinned down. We need competent and longer-term government planning coming through. And we need an economy that is going to have energy security as well. And these are all massive challenges for any government to deal with.
Yes, they are indeed. How do you forecast the next year? Do you think that the economy will... do you think that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak's strategy to tackle inflation first and then focus on growth is the right one?
Yes, we do. I mean, obviously, the prime deliverer of inflation back to price stability is the Bank of England. But what the Bank of England wouldn't be able to manage, for example, is to restore price stability against a backdrop where the government was providing fiscal supports and otherwise trying to inflate the economy. So it's good to see the institutions of government moving together. And I think longer term growth is based on a framework of long-term price stability and security in that long-term price stability. So we do think that's important. And I think from a household perspective, we've all suffered from very sharp increases coming through in pricing. Real incomes have really struggled. That's part of the reason we've seen such weak economic activity, why we think it'll be recessionary into 2023. So as we get inflation under control, and thankfully with wholesale gas prices moving a little bit lower, that might accelerate that process in the second half of this year. That is something that I think consumers and businesses alike can look forward to as providing some relief that might start to see the economy growing again.
Thank you very much indeed. That was, of course, David Page, Head of Macro Research at AXA Investment Managers. Thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Now, moving on. Last year saw a staggering 19% increase compared to the year before in homicides with a knife. The number of people killed with a knife in England and Wales has reached its highest level since records began 76 years ago. That's according to the Office for National Statistics. The areas worst affected were the West Midlands, London, Greater Manchester and Cleveland. I am delighted to be joined by Norman Brennan, a former police officer who served for over 30 years and a prominent campaigner on issues pertaining to law and order. Thank you very much indeed, Norman, for joining us this morning. I mean, these numbers are staggering, the number of fatalities at the hands of a knife. What do you think the causes are for this rise?
Well, there's many causes, but the first point I'd like to make clear is that these were foreseeable, predictable and preventable. As a serving police officer myself, I was stabbed in the chest by an armed burglar, had a devastating effect on my life, and I realised the devastation of knife crime. So on the 13th of December 2004, along with people like Damilola Taylor's father and many other families affected by knife crime, I went to number 10 Downing Street in full uniform, something police officers don't do, wrote a letter to the Queen and every MP and told them that I predicted that knife crime would become an epidemic if it wasn't effectively dealt with. Many people listened, nobody acted. What are we talking about almost 20 years on? Knife crime out of control on the streets of Britain. Only 2 years ago in London, we had the highest homicide child rate on record. 30 children were murdered, 27 were stabbed to death, 2 were killed in an arson and 1 shot. What do we need to do about it? We actually need to act. We've been skirting around the issues for ages. We need to introduce 5 years mandatory prison sentence for those found on the streets with a knife without lawful authority or reasonable excuse. That's what the law is. 5 years imprisonment is identical to that if you are armed with a gun. You're more likely to be stabbed to death 3 times than shot to death, yet you can still walk out of court with a fine or a conditional discharge. And these are lethal weapons. And the caveat to how serious it really is, Emily, is this. In the past 3 years, my colleagues within policing seized 37,000 knives. So anybody that says that stop and search doesn't work, every single one of those knives, Emily, could have murdered another person or could have cost the carrier their life. I believe that the true figure is probably 10, 15, 20 times that size. Now, it is a major problem and nobody seems to grasp it. We need mass stop and search. Sadly, we don't have the police officers to do it. We get criticised, or certainly the police get criticised by some sections of the community, but it's often the families within those communities that are pleading in mortuaries with their child lying dead on a mortuary slab 2 meters away that plead and fall into the arms bereft of police officers, praying and pleading that we do all we can. Well, if the police do the best that they can, but the judiciary don't play their part, I'm afraid it's a circle we just don't seem to be able to break.
So, Norman, more stop and search and harsher penalties for those caught with knives. Do you think it's time to call a national emergency on this? Does Cobra need to get involved?
It is that serious. It is a national emergency. It is so serious that I'm afraid crime in Britain, homicide, which is my expert subject as well, is a subject that's not a sexy subject. It rarely gets any attention. And I'll tell you how serious I think it is that sometimes there are certain demographics that kill each other. And somehow there are a few people in society that think, well, it's just one criminal killing another criminal. But when has it ever been right for any parent to have to plan a funeral rather than a future for their child? And don't forget, this generation have to hand over to the next generation the best possible and safest streets possible. Police, I'm afraid, have lost control of the streets. Not their fault. They were reduced by 22,000 police officers about 12 years ago. They can barely cope with everyday crime. So who is tackling knife crime? We need a massive education program. We need mentors to take some of these kids to one side. When I joined the police, and just beforehand, it was a Dixon, a Doc Green era. There was respect, moral fibre, community spirit. And police officers like myself interacted with the public, we could see some of the kids that were going awry. And often we'd sit down, take our helmet off and speak to them like a human being should be spoken to, with care, compassion, and tell them the vision we have for them and how they could turn their lives around. And do you know what, Emily? In many cases, we were able to redirect some of these kids that we now see out of control on our streets who have no hope. They have no hope for the future, no hope for or vision for a good purpose in life, and they're lost. And when you're lost, then you have no value of life. You don't have any issues whatsoever carrying a knife, taking a life, or even losing your own. Now, if we've got kids in 2023 with that ethos, what hope have we got for the next generation?
Well, there you go, a sober analysis. Thank you very much, Norman Brennan, former police officer who's also served for over 30 years and is a prominent campaigner on issues relating to law and order. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Now, moving on, our last story of today's programme with the appointment of Redditch's Rachel Maclean as the latest in a long line of housing ministers. Let's take a little look back on the Ministers of State for Housing since 2013. There we go. We have Lucy Fraser, October to February 2023. Lucy Fraser there, sorry. Then we have Lee Rowley. Then we have Marcus Jones. Then we have Stuart Andrew, February 22 to July 22. Chris Pincher, February 2020 to February 22. Esther McVeigh, July 2019 to February 2020. Kit Malthouse. Then we have Dominic Raab, January 2018 to July 2018. Alex Sharma, June 2017 to January 2018. Gavin Barwell, July 2016 to June 2017. Brandon Lewis. Then we have Chris Hopkins, Mark Brisk. And finally, Grant Shapps. Right, there we go. A long list of housing ministers. We've had more than our fair share there. I am joined now by Freddie Poser, Director of Priced Out UK. Freddie, 15 housing ministers since 2010. Is this the reason why we failed to get to grips with the housing crisis?
Well, it certainly can't help. No. I think that it's a symptom rather than the cause of the issue. When the position was created many years ago, housing was seen as the first public service. A real political heavyweight should be in that job. Now it's seen as this junior position that you get and then you move up. And as you can see, the consequence of that, we've had 15 since 2010, and we've had 6 in the last year. So no one's staying in the role and paying attention to this crucial issue. And there's a huge amount in the in-tray for the housing minister to deal with. There's mould in buildings, there's the building safety crisis, there's the housing crisis itself. This takes real political will and someone to put in a lot of effort, and you can't do that if you've only got, like the last housing minister, 3 months in the job. So what we need, and I'm sure Rachel Maclean's got a huge amount of experience in planning and infrastructure, and I'm sure she can do a good job, but we need someone to stay in that job, focus on the issues, and actually deliver the change that we need to see. Yes,
I mean, you could say this about many departments. Many Secretary of State positions in this country and ministerial positions are they always change hands. It's always a new person doing the top job, and it doesn't seem to be an effective way of doing government. If you had a business that was constantly changing its chief executive, you'd probably have the same problem. So what should the new housing minister be focusing on day one?
Well, I think part of the issue is the supply of housing. I think that the real cause of our housing crisis is we haven't built enough homes for many decades. This is a particularly thorny political issue, and other secretaries of state in Levelling Up and ministers have tried and failed to grapple with this question. We need to make sure that houses are being built. One of the things that a housing minister can do best at the moment is pay attention to the Levelling Up Bill and street votes, which are in the Levelling Up Bill. I think those have a lot of promise to deliver quite a few houses. But more generally, we need to take a look at what is stopping these houses getting built and what can central government, local government and with the housing minister sort of playing between those, what can make that happen?
Now, a lot of our viewers will either themselves or have children who are renting in the private rental market, and if they've had a look at Rightmove or or spareroom.com and all sorts of sites that show properties, they'll see that rents have skyrocketed. What can the government do when it comes to that? Of course, the Labour Party, including Sadiq Khan, have been talking about rent controls. That seems to me the wrong solution. What should the government be doing when it comes to the rental market?
Well, unfortunately, the rental market is a really big issue. And I agree with you, rent controls are not a solution. They will only make the problem worse in the long term, whilst a privileged few stay in rent-controlled housing. We see this across the world when it's tried. It does not make things better. It can really kill cities. So I think rent control is a bad answer, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have a better answer, especially in the short term. In the medium and long term, we need to get that supply up. We need to, in our cities, especially London, we need to increase gentle density, slowly make better use of existing land so that more people can live here and that rents fall and that values per unit come down.
What do you say to people who might be sitting at home thinking, I don't want any more development in my area. I bought my home or rented my home when they're, for a reason, in an area that was less densely populated. What do you say to those people? Are they being selfish?
Well, everyone's always being selfish in the market. That's how these things work. I think we need to find ways to bring people like that along with us. I think previous Secretaries of State and housing ministers have tried to ignore those concerns and it simply hasn't worked.
No.
So things like street votes and other policies in those veins try, well, how can we actually generate the consensus that leads to more building? The outcome we need is more building. It's about finding solutions that are going to work to get us there.
There we go. More building is needed, but I would like more beautiful buildings to be built. There are some absolutely monstrosities out there. Thank you very much indeed, Freddie Poser, Director of Priced Out UK. That's all we have time for this morning on The Briefing. But don't worry, coming up, it's Esther and Phil.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent.